Mama needs help.
A little girl knocked at midnight. Mama needs help. The widowed rancher lit every lantern. Winter Hollow, Colorado Territory, midwinter, 1882. Winter Hollow lay nestled between craggy peaks and snow-laden pines, a quiet town half forgotten by time. Since late autumn, snow had blanketed the land, piling higher than wagon wheels. By midwinter, the cold bit harder than wolves, and even the wind howled like something wild and lost. High above the town, on a ridge swallowed by drifts, stood a lonely log cabin, dark, silent, and still. No candle flickered behind its windows, no smoke rose from its chimney. It looked like a home abandoned, but it wasn't. It was simply a house where hope had long since died. Inside sat Eli Morgan. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, bearded, rugged, worn down by years of sorrow. 6 winters ago, a sudden blizzard stole his wife, Rose, and their daughter, Lily, while he was away on a hunt. Since then, Eli had lived in silence, lighting no lamps after sunset, speaking to no one, keeping company only with ghosts and the creak of old wood. On this particular night, as snow fell thick outside and the hearth remained cold, Eli sat hunched in a chair, staring at nothing. Then, rap, rap, rap. He blinked. A knock? It came again, sharper this time, against the wood. Eli stood slowly, his joints protested, as if unused to movement. He stepped to the door and opened it. A rush of icy wind filled the room, and standing at the threshold was a little girl, no more than 6, wrapped in a threadbare shawl. Her cheeks were flushed, her lips trembling, her hair laced with snowflakes. She didn't cry, she didn't beg, but her eyes burned with something stronger than fear. "Please, mister," she said, voice tight and cracking. "Mama needs help. She fell, and she can't breathe right." Eli stared. No one had knocked on his door in years. No one had dared, but here stood this child, shaking in the cold, eyes locked on his like she knew, somehow, that he was her only chance. He crouched beside her, his voice rough from disuse. "How far is your mama, sweetheart?" "Down the river bend," she whispered. "We were riding. Mama fell off. I tried to help, but she told me to run. To find someone." Her small fists clenched at her sides. She looked exhausted, but not broken. That fire in her eyes reminded Eli too much of Lily, his little girl who never gave up, even in stories. Without a word, Eli pulled off his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around her. "Let's get you warm first. Then we'll go get your mama." She blinked, nodding slowly. He lifted her gently into the cabin, set her near the door, then turned toward the corner where an old chest sat unopened for years. Inside lay a collection of lanterns, dusty but intact. One by one, Eli lit them, his fingers trembling not from cold but from memory. He set the lanterns along the porch, by the steps, on fence posts, still peeking through snow. The warm glow pushed back the dark like a prayer. It was the first time in 6 years light had touched this home. Then Eli took the storm lantern from its hook. It was battered, its brass dull, but the glass still held steady. He filled it with oil, struck a match, and watched as the wick flared to life. Amber light pooled across the floor. The girl, still silent, watched everything with wide eyes. Eli looked down at her. "What's your name?" "Emma." He nodded once. "I'm Eli." He took her small hand in his, the storm lantern in the other. "We will find your mama, Emma. I promise you that." Together, they stepped into the swirling snow, one tall, one small. The lantern's glow lit a golden path ahead, and for the first time in years, Eli Morgan walked into the night, not away from grief, but toward something worth saving. Snow slashed sideways across the lantern glass, its light flickering wildly as Eli pushed forward through thigh-deep drifts. Emma clung to his side, half lifted by his strong arm, her tiny boots vanishing into the snow with every step. "We're almost there," she whispered, pointing toward a clump of trees by the river, her voice brittle with cold. "Just past those pines." Eli nodded, jaw clenched. His breath steamed like smoke in the frigid dark. They crested a small ridge, and there, barely visible beneath a blanket of white, lay Maybelle Carter. She was crumpled in a hollow by the tree line, her dark hair stiff with frost, one hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. The mare she'd ridden stood nearby, reins tangled on a low branch, snorting and pawing anxiously. Maybelle. Eli dropped to his knees, brushing snow from her face. Her lips were pale, her skin clammy despite the freezing air. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, and her eyes fluttered open only briefly before rolling back. "She fell hard," Emma said, voice trembling now. "The horse slipped on the river bend. She screamed once, then stopped talking." Eli pressed his hand gently against her belly. Beneath the layers, the muscles were tight, too tight. He could feel it. The pain wasn't just the fall. This was labor, coming far too early, and wrong. "Maybelle," he called firmly, leaning close. "You hear me? I'm taking you home. Hold on." Her eyes flickered open again, pain lancing through them like lightning. "The baby," she rasped. I can't." "You can," he said, already unfastening his coat. "But not here." In one smooth motion, Eli stripped off his oilskin coat and wrapped it tightly around her belly, securing it with the leather strap from his saddlebag. Blood had seeped through her skirt and was beginning to stain the snow. "I need both of you to stay strong," he said, his voice gruff but steady. He lifted Maybelle into his arms. She cried out softly but did not resist. Her entire body was limp with exhaustion and pain. Emma reached up, taking her mother's cold fingers in her own as they began the long trek back. Snow blasted into their faces, biting and blinding, but Eli pushed forward. Step by brutal step, he carried Maybelle across the frozen land, Emma trudging silently beside him, one hand clutching her mother's and the other holding tight to Eli's coat. His breath came heavier now, fogging the lamp's glass. Every muscle screamed with strain, but he dared not slow. Each gust of wind was a whisper from the past. "You weren't there in time. You left them too long. You failed them. Not again. Not tonight." He looked down at the woman in his arms and the child at his side, two souls clinging to life by the thinnest thread. When the cabin finally came into view, lit now by the lanterns he had left burning, Eli surged forward with the last of his strength. Inside, he laid Maybelle gently on the worn settee near the fire. Emma crawled beside her, brushing her hair back with trembling fingers. "She's gonna be okay now, right?" she asked, voice nearly gone. Eli paused. His hands were bloodied. The fire crackled. Maybelle moaned, one hand still pressed to her belly, her body convulsing as another contraction tore through her. There was no time. The nearest doctor was over 20 miles away. No rider could make it through the storm in time. He stood still for a long moment, watching her labor through clenched teeth, watching Emma curl protectively beside her. Then Eli Morgan turned to the kitchen, grabbed the cleanest linens he owned, fetched a pail of warm water, and took a long, steadying breath. "I will not lose another family to the storm," he muttered to himself. Eli looked back at the woman lying in pain, and the child looking up at him with silent trust, and he made the choice. He would stay. He would fight. He would deliver this child himself, tonight, no matter what it took. The storm still raged outside. Wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and snow piled higher against the windows. Inside, the dim kitchen flickered with the trembling glow of a single oil lamp. Shadows danced on the wooden walls, long and restless. Maybelle lay on the thick blanket Eli had spread across the worn kitchen table, her breath ragged, skin pale, hair drenched with sweat. Her hands gripped the edges of the table as another wave of pain overtook her. Eli knelt at her side, sleeves rolled up, hands trembling slightly as he tried to steady her breathing. "Breathe, Maybelle," he said softly but firmly. "I will not fail you again." His voice cracked. He had once stood in a similar room, miles away, holding his wife's hand as she slipped from him. Too much blood, too little help. The echo of her cries haunted him even now. But this time he would not freeze, would not hesitate. Emma sat on a stool beside her mother's head, holding her hand tightly. The little girl had not cried since the night began, but now tears welled up in her eyes. "She's hurting, Mr. Eli," she whispered. "I know, sweetheart, but your voice can help her. Talk to her, tell her something nice, something that makes her smile." Emma nodded, wiping her nose with her sleeve. She leaned close and began whispering a story about a horse with wings, about the summer her mama took her swimming in the lake. Her voice was shaky, but steady, gentle, steady. Another contraction seized Maybelle's body. She arched with pain and moaned. Blood soaked the linens beneath her. Eli worked quickly, applying pressure where he could. His jaw set, sweat dripping down his temples. The baby was coming fast, and not well. "You're not alone," Eli whispered. "Not this time. Not ever again." Maybelle slipped in and out of consciousness. Her fingers clenched Eli's arm in moments of agony, and each time she faded, Emma's small voice brought her back. The baby's heartbeat faltered. The rhythm was off. Eli felt panic rise in his chest, but he swallowed it. He forced his mind to stay focused. Every movement had to count. "You're almost there, Maybelle," he said. "One more push. You can do this." Maybelle's lips moved, but no sound came. Her body trembled with exhaustion. "Push," Eli said again, louder. "Now." She screamed, raw and full, and then silence. A single heartbeat passed. Then came the cry. Sharp, strong, impossibly loud in the small room, the first cry of new life. Emma gasped, her eyes wide with wonder. Eli held the tiny child in his arms, slick with blood and warmth, and the storm outside seemed to hush, just for a moment. A little girl, red-faced and furious, kicked her feet and wailed. Eli laughed, choked with emotion. His hands, stained and shaking, cradled the infant with a tenderness he thought had died with his own child. He wrapped her carefully in the soft flannel blanket he had kept for years, the one meant for Lily. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice breaking. He turned to Emma. "You have a baby sister." Emma's smile broke through the tears. Maybelle opened her eyes slowly, lips trembling. "Is she?" she whispered. "She's perfect," Eli said, placing the baby gently on her chest. Maybelle cried then, softly, as her hands found her child. And Eli, for the first time in 6 years, sat down, let his head fall into his hands, and wept. Not for the past, but for the miracle that had bloomed in the middle of a storm. The kitchen, once so cold and silent, now pulsed with life. New life. And a man who had lived in shadows now held the light. Morning came slow and pale, seeping through the frost-laced window like a timid guest. The small kitchen still smelled faintly of smoke and blood, but now it held something else too, warmth. Maybelle lay on the makeshift bed, her cheeks still pale, but her breathing steady, lips parted softly in sleep. Her hair clung to her damp temples. One hand rested protectively on the small bundle curled against her chest. Beside her, Emma sat on a wooden chair, too small for the long night she had endured. Her head leaned against her mother's arm, mouth slightly open in sleep. One small hand still clung to Maybelle's fingers. Across the room, Eli sat on the floor, his back resting against the cold wall, knees bent. His eyes were open, but soft. In his lap, the newborn slept, wrapped tight in the soft flannel and the gentleness of his touch. He looked down at her tiny face, the rise and fall of her breath. Then he reached over to the bucket of warm water and rinsed his hands slowly, deliberately. The blood had dried in the creases of his knuckles. The cloth he used to dry them had belonged to his wife once, embroidered with a faded rose. Eli moved carefully, unwrapping the baby, inspecting her fingers, her toes, her perfect tiny lungs that had filled the room with the first cry of dawn. He found a clean scrap of linen, folded it, and changed her with hands that trembled, but not from fear, from reverence. "You came through the storm," he whispered to her. "You're stronger than you look." A soft rustle came from the bed. Maybelle blinked slowly, her eyes struggling to focus, until they landed on him. Her voice cracked like thin ice. "You saved us." Eli looked up. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he shook his head gently, still cradling the baby in his arms. "Emma found me. I just followed her light." Maybelle's eyes shimmered, but she did not cry. She only watched as he moved closer, laying the baby into her arms with such care it could have been glass. A moment passed, and then Maybelle saw the blanket. "This was hers?" she asked, her fingers brushing the faded pink hem. Eli nodded once. It was Lily's. She held the child tighter, like holding her in that piece of memory would somehow keep her warmer. He rose without a word and walked to a small chest tucked near the door. From it, he pulled out another blanket, an old coat, actually, a woman's coat, thick wool, patched at the elbows. He laid it gently over Maybelle's legs. "You'll need it more than I ever did." The sunlight crept across the wooden floor, warming the room slowly. Eli walked to the window, hands at his sides. Then, in a motion almost forgotten, he unlatched it. The hinges groaned, but the glass pushed open. A rush of cold air entered, but with it came birdsong. Weak, but real. He stepped back and let the light fall across the kitchen table. Emma stirred, blinking awake. Her face was pale, but her smile was as wide as the sun. "Is Mama okay?" she asked, voice groggy. Maybelle nodded. "We're okay now, baby." Eli brought over the plate of bread he had warmed by the stove. "Breakfast," he said. "It is not much, but it is warm." They ate slowly, the three of them, bread, a little honey, warm water in tin mugs, the baby nursed quietly in Maybelle's arms. When they had finished, Eli put on his coat, stepped outside, and crossed the yard where the snow was beginning to melt under the thin touch of morning. At the edge of the field stood two wooden markers, old and weathered. He knelt before them, pulling from his coat pocket a single white flower, brittle from the cold, but still beautiful. He laid it at the base of the stone that read, "Rose and Lily Morgan." His voice was soft, almost lost in the wind. "I could not save you, but maybe saving them is part of making peace." The wind answered with a low hush, and Eli stood in silence, letting the sunlight finally reach his back. The spring air was cool as Eli guided his horse into Winter Hollow, the hooves crunching over thawing earth and patches of stubborn snow. It had been 6 long years since he'd ridden down Main Street, but now he carried with him a reason and a responsibility. He tied the horse outside the general store and stepped inside to buy medicine, cloth diapers, and herbs. Heads turned. Conversations dipped to murmurs. Someone whispered near the dry goods aisle, "Did you hear? There's a woman up at his ranch." And a baby, too. Another voice, hushed but biting, added, 6 years in the dark, and now he brings a widow into his house. A baby born right there, they say. Whole town saw him ride in with blood on his coat. Eli said nothing. He paid, tipped his hat to the stunned cashier, and left. The weight of their words did not show on his face, but it followed him like a second shadow. Behind those whispers stood Jed Barlow. Jed was a rough man, a rancher known more for his mouth than his manners. He had once made a move on Maybelle shortly after her husband died and had not taken her refusal kindly. Now, seeing her survive and find shelter, not in his arms, but at Eli Morgan's, lit a bitter fire in him. She ran to the first man who opened his door. Jed sneered to anyone who would listen at the saloon. 8 months along and now living with him up there, day and night. You call that decent? A few women in town, who prided themselves on appearances more than compassion, echoed his tone. It's about the example. What are we teaching our daughters? Others hesitated. They remembered Maybelle as kind, quiet, a good mother. But whispers have a way of staining even the cleanest reputations. Back at the ranch, Maybelle sat on the porch with her newborn in her arms. When Eli returned and she saw the tightness in his jaw, she didn't need to ask. She knew. They're talking, aren't they? He nodded. Slow. Jed started it. Others joined in. She stood, swaying slightly from weakness, and went inside. Within minutes, she was packing. I won't have Emma grow up in whispers, she said firmly, though her hands trembled. I won't let her walk into town and see pity in every eye. Or worse. Eli watched, unmoving. Then, softly, he spoke. I'll ride with you, wherever you go. But I won't let fear decide for you. His voice was steady, but his heart thundered. From behind the doorframe, a small voice interrupted. Emma had heard everything. She stepped out, cheeks flushed, little fists clenched at her sides. I heard them, saying bad things about Mama. Maybelle turned, startled. Emma, you don't need to. But the girl lifted her chin. My mama is brave, she said loud and clear, voice shaking but unwavering. She saved my baby brother. She walked through snow. And Mr. Eli is kind. He saved us both. Silence. A neighbor, who had wandered up the path, stood frozen. More people in the town had gathered than either Eli or Maybelle realized. And every one of them heard the girl. The rawness in her tone, the conviction in her tiny frame, it was stronger than any sermon, more honest than any defense. A woman in the back wiped her eyes. A man near the steps looked down at his boots. No one spoke. Maybelle knelt and pulled Emma into her arms, holding her tight. Eli stood beside them, not speaking, but something in his eyes had softened, the edge of pain dulled by the edge of pride. No more words were needed. Because when truth is spoken by a child, it cuts deeper than rumor and heals faster than silence. The wind had softened by morning, but snow still blanketed the roof in thick silence. Inside the old ranch house, something had changed, not in the weather, but in the air. Eli stood out front, eyes scanning the sagging shingles above the porch. The roof had held through the storm, but barely. The woman and her baby resting inside deserved better than barely. He climbed onto the ladder without a word and began stripping damaged tiles, hammering in new ones he'd salvaged from the barn. He worked slow, methodical, shoulders hunched against the chill. He didn't wait for thanks. He didn't ask for approval. He simply built something stronger, one nail at a time. Inside, Maybelle watched through the window, baby cradled against her shoulder. Her body still ached from the birth, but her heart ached more from the sight of a man working without pride or demand. Just kindness. That evening, Emma set the table. She stood on her tiptoes to smooth out the napkins, trying to fold them like she remembered her mama doing when Papa was still alive. They weren't perfect, but she was proud. Maybelle ladled stew into tin bowls, humming softly. The aroma of carrots, onions, and leftover roast filled the small kitchen. Eli entered quietly, removing his coat and hanging it by the door. His hands were cracked and calloused from the day, but when he reached for the salt, he passed it gently, like it was the most natural thing in the world. They ate without much talk. Just the clinking of spoons, the crackle of the hearth, and the occasional happy gurgle from the newborn in a basket by the stove. It was a simple meal: stew, stale bread, warm tea. But to the three of them, it might as well have been a feast. At one point, Eli looked up and caught Emma watching him. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked softly. Emma shook her head, grinning. "This feels like home." Neither adult spoke, but they both smiled. After the meal, Eli excused himself and went to the old trunk at the foot of his bed. He hadn't opened it in years. Not since the funeral. He lifted the lid slowly, dust motes dancing in the lantern light. Inside was a folded dress, a dried bouquet, and a small velvet pouch. He brought the pouch back into the kitchen and held it out to Maybelle. She looked at him, puzzled. "What's this?" Eli didn't sit. He only stood there, eyes kind but distant. "It was Rose's," he said. "A silver locket. She wore it the day we married." Maybelle hesitated, her hand hovering. "I can't." "You can," he said gently. "For the baby. It brought love once. Maybe it will again." Her fingers closed around the pouch. She didn't open it yet. She only whispered, "Thank you." Later that night, after Maybelle had gone to bed and Emma had curled into her quilts, Eli sat alone at the table, a cup of cooling tea untouched beside him. He pulled out a sheet of paper and dipped the pen. He had written letters before, to no one, to ghosts, to himself, but tonight he addressed it to the one family that had every right to hate him: Rose's parents. "Dear Henry and Jean, it's been 6 winters. I don't expect forgiveness, and I wouldn't know what to do with it if it came. But I want you to know, I've found light again. It's not the same. It never could be. But something knocked at my door one night. A little girl, scared, cold, asking for help. And in helping her, I found something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to light the lanterns again." The ink bled slightly as he paused. Then he finished. "I hope you're well. I hope one day, if you ever find your way out here, you'll meet the reason I came back to life. It all started with a knock at midnight." He folded the letter, sealed it, and placed it beside the lantern. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. Inside, the light stayed on. And for the first time in years, Eli Morgan didn't feel alone. Spring came late to Winter Hollow, but when it did, it came gently. The thick layers of snow had receded, leaving behind damp earth and the first brave clusters of wildflowers pushing up along the fence line. The air smelled of pine sap and turned soil. For the first time in many years, the sun felt warm again. Eli was in the field, hammering new posts into the ground, replacing what winter had cracked and broken. Each swing of the mallet echoed not just strength, but purpose. On the porch, Maybelle sat with a pail beside her, wringing out a line of clean baby cloths. Her sleeves were rolled, hair pinned up, and for the first time since that harrowing night, her cheeks carried color. She paused to look out across the field at Eli. Emma was barefoot in the yard, chasing a moth with a ribbon in her hand, her laughter as light as the breeze. Chickens pecked nearby, and from the open kitchen window came the scent of fresh bread. The ranch, once a place of silence and shadows, now pulsed with life. It was no longer just Eli's house. It was something more. That evening, Maybelle set the table with care. She used the best dishes, still chipped, but polished, and wiped the wooden surface until it glowed in the fading sun. She steeped tea leaves in a tin pot and lit the small lamp, not for necessity, but for comfort. When Eli stepped in, wiping dirt from his hands, she met him with a quiet smile, not words. That was her invitation. That was her yes. Emma took her seat between them, chattering as she passed the bread and talked about bees and clouds and the rabbit she had named Button. She was the thread, sewing their stories together with her voice. Maybelle reached to pour Eli a cup of tea. As she handed it to him, her fingers brushed his. He did not pull back. Instead, he looked at her, really looked, and she looked back. Neither spoke, neither needed to. In that glance, there was more than gratitude, more than companionship. There was a promise, unspoken but strong. They had survived something dark and unrelenting. And now, with the snow gone, their hearts had room to bloom. After supper, Maybelle disappeared into the other room. She returned holding something carefully folded, a coat. Eli's coat. The one he had wrapped around Emma the night she knocked on his door. She stepped forward and, without a word, draped it over his shoulders. "You gave this to save someone you didn't know," she said, voice soft but sure. "I'm keeping it now, and the man who gave it." Eli stood frozen for a moment, eyes locked on hers. Then he placed his hand over hers, where it still rested on the fabric. There was no need for more words. Later that night, the porch lantern glowed, not out of fear, but by choice. Eli sat outside as Emma danced in the grass, naming fireflies, chasing their glow. She paused, picked up the lantern, and turned to him. "I want to name it," she declared. Eli raised an eyebrow. "The lantern?" Emma nodded. "It's hope," she said firmly, "because it keeps coming back." Eli laughed, the sound warm and unburdened. Maybelle came to the doorway, baby on her hip, and smiled at the scene. The darkness was still there, somewhere on the edges of memory, but it no longer ruled the house. Light had found its way in, and it stayed. 1 year later, the winds no longer howled through Winter Hollow. They sang. In the mornings, children's laughter echoed from the front room of the ranch house. Maybelle had turned it into a schoolroom. Kids from nearby homesteads came for reading, writing, and warm biscuits fresh from the oven. Their muddy boots lined up on the porch, and their coats hung on makeshift pegs near the hearth. Books, laughter, and the scent of honey butter filled the air. Eli opened the old barn and began hosting weary travelers. Ranchers, hunters, and lost wanderers all found coffee, kindness, and a roof under his care. He never asked too many questions, only offered warmth and a place to rest. The baby, now a wide-eyed crawler with a thick shock of dark hair, gurgled happily in a woven cradle. Emma had grown taller. Her braids were longer, her freckles more pronounced, but her eyes were still just as clear, just as full of light. Every morning, just as the sun peeked over the ridge, 3 soft knocks would come at Eli's door. "Morning, Mr. Eli, breakfast's ready." It had become their ritual. And every morning, Eli answered with the same words and a warm grin, "Be right there, sweetheart." The knocks no longer signaled panic, nor desperation. They were an invitation to family, to warmth, to the day ahead, an echo of something broken made whole. Sometimes, Emma would knock even if she knew he was already up, just to be sure the day began right. And Eli always answered, even if he had already been standing behind the door. One evening, as the sky burned gold and rose, the whole family walked up the gentle hill above the ranch. Eli carried the baby on his back in a soft blanket sling. Maybelle walked beside him, hand in hand, her dress brushing wildflowers. Emma raced ahead, her dress catching the wind, a small dog barking joyfully at her heels. They stopped at the crest, looking down at the house, its windows glowing with golden light, smoke curling gently from the chimney. A swing creaked on the porch, and the garden rose shimmered in the dusk like a promise kept. Eli turned to look at them, at the woman who brought spring into his frozen life, at the daughter who knocked on his door when the world had gone silent, and at the child who was born in the middle of a storm. He took a slow breath. The trees swayed gently behind them, rustling like whispered blessings. And there, still hanging on the porch, the old lantern burned. Not because it had to, but because now, someone always lit it. One knock changed everything. It lit a lantern that had long gone cold. It wasn't just a cry for help, it was the sound of hope coming home. If a little girl knocked at midnight, "Mama needs help," the widowed rancher lit every lantern, touched your heart, hit that hype button, and help us spread the warmth of hope through the coldest storms. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more heartfelt tales of love, redemption, and resilience from the rugged frontier. The lanterns are still glowing, and the stories are just getting started. See you in the next ride.